Today is the fourth Sunday in Epiphany. I have to put my glasses on. And Epiphany, again, is celebrating Christ coming to the whole world, including the Gentiles. And I love that reading that we had this morning with Jesus speaking to his hometown. And he's like, don't forget, I've come for the Gentiles. And they didn't really like it. They tried to throw him off a cliff. They didn't like that. But Jesus did come for the whole world, including us. We're all Gentiles here, and we are grateful for Epiphany and the knowledge that comes through Epiphany as we go, aha, look, Jesus came. It's like he came for the whole world. So the first two chapters of Ruth that we're going through, Ruth, as some of you may know, if you haven't been here for the last 2 weeks, that's what we're doing. And today we're covering Ruth chapter 2. And the first chapter of Ruth that John's been preaching the last 2 weeks really focused on Naomi's suffering and her despair. And it sounds like if you had just come to the first 2 weeks and you didn't read any more, you would think it was a Shakespearean tragedy. You would think that this story is just the saddest of the sad, and there's just hopeless. And just like every Shakespearean tragedy, it just ends in death at the end, and you go, why did I read this story, right? Well, that is not what this story is. This is not a Shakespearean tragedy. This story is a story of redemption, and it is a romance, okay? If you don't like romances, I'm sorry. Our God is a God of romance, and this story is about love and redemptive love and how it just can pop up out of nowhere, and it is important to God. And if we were going to, many people today would probably compare this. I told John last week I'm going to say this. I'm just going to go with it. This is like a Hallmark movie, okay? The way that it is written, and I'm going to try to pull some of this out for you as we go through the story. The writer of this story used some literary techniques that we would, if we were watching it, it would be like a Hallmark movie where we go, oh, this is just too sappy. This is just like, really? Like, are you kidding me? Like, there's too many coincidences where we would roll our eyes. Okay, the reader of this story at the time and the culture would have rolled their eyes. They would have been like, this is too much. Of course it's that guy. It's like the guy that comes out of the hardware store and you know that he's the one that's going to run into the girl, right? That is what's happening here, okay? So this is one of the oldest love stories ever told. It is before Helen of Troy was written. It was before, obviously, Romeo and Juliet. It was before Antony and Cleopatra. It was before Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, okay? This story was written before there was Jim and Pam, all right? It is a delightful story that has so much meaning and divine significance. So we can roll our eyes. We can say, oh, it's got a tragic beginning. Of course it does. Oh, it's got predictable twists. Of course it does. And it has a happy ending. I'm just going to spoiler. It's got a happy ending. But this story is told with divine significance that can impact our lives and change us as we see how God is a redemptive and faithful God. So from the dark opening of Naomi's story, a tale emerges. Okay, I'm quoting John here. A tale emerges, or a story emerges of a tale of God's faithfulness and one woman's unshakable devotion. Now, doesn't that sound like a movie trailer? Yeah, it does. Okay, so to recap for you, Naomi and her husband, they left Israel. They went to Moab. Bad tragedies. Husband dies. Both of her sons die. She's left destitute. She's got 2 daughters-in-law. She tries to talk them into turning back to their own gods. And she says, I'm going back to my people, but you stay here. And Orpha does go back, but Ruth is the one who says, your people will be my people and your God my God. We see Ruth's devotion come out. We see her. She is so devoted is the word. She's faithful. She sticks by her mother-in-law, and she comes to Israel. I think she says, your God's going to be my God. There's something about this Yahweh God that she wants to follow him, and she's determined. And so they moved back to Israel. So you can see them getting off the bus, okay? They step off the bus. They're in Bethlehem, and they're just looking around, and it is harvest season. Okay, they haven't had a good harvest in over 10 years. So you can imagine it is bustling. People are excited. It is probably full of activity. And they get off the bus and they're destitute. They have no home. They have no people. They have no protection. But hope is on the horizon. Naomi is bitter. Remember, she gets off the bus. She's bitter. She has said, God, I think the last words that she said is that she's been abandoned by God. She doesn't really want to have anything to do with him. She feels like he has just left her. So where we pick up in the story in Ruth 2 is Naomi's going to stay over here. It's like the author of this story says, Naomi, we're just going to sit you right here. We're going to hold your story for a little bit. And the scene moves, and the main characters are going to become Ruth and Boaz. So in our Hallmark movie, here comes Boaz. Okay, it's like you go, of course this is the guy, right? They get off the bus in Bethlehem. It's a harvest season, Harvest of the Heart. That's the name of the movie, right? And so you see Boaz, and here's what we know about Boaz. Immediately, Ruth 2, verse 1, the author says, it's like he gives you a little foreshadowing. He's like, okay, pay attention, this is the guy, okay? And he says, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, so when we know he's of Naomi's clan, and we know he's a worthy man. He's wealthy. He's respected. He's noble. Our protagonist enters. He's strong. He's faithful. He's every Hallmark's leading man. Every Hallmark movie's leading man, okay? And so then it immediately goes back to Ruth and Naomi. And like I said, Naomi's going to stay over on the side, and Ruth is going to come to the center of the story. And what we see her do is she's not passive in her hardships. Now, this is a young woman who's a widow. She's moved to a new country. She may understand some of the language because her dialect was a little bit similar to Hebrew, but she certainly has an accent. She doesn't know all the customs. She has no protection whatsoever. There's not a man in her family that can protect her. So she's like a person who could just sit in despair if she wanted to, but that's not who she is. Naomi's going to sit over there. Naomi's not going to do much. But Ruth, she gets up and she takes action. We see that she's not passive in her hardship, but she does the next needed thing. She chooses to work rather than to sit. And in difficult times, our faith is often lived out by doing the next needed thing, even when it's uncertain, even when it may seem scary. And we see that character in Ruth, that's what she does. So this idea of the next needed thing, sometimes that can be overwhelming. Sometimes you're sitting, sometimes in our life, maybe we're suffering from depression. Maybe there's something that's come up in our life that a situation with a family member or an illness, and we feel stuck, and we feel like there's no way forward, and we don't see the path ahead. And so what do we do? And that's the question. And I think one of the things that the Lord has for you today, for all of us today, is the importance of doing the next needed thing. Maybe the next needed thing is getting up and taking a walk around the block. Sometimes the next needed thing is taking a nap. One of the first times I ever heard Jonathan preach, I knew I had married the right man when he said, sometimes the most holy thing you can do is go take a nap. Because if you're struggling with your attitude or maybe you're overwhelmed with things, sometimes if you're just stretched to the end, just the holiness of taking a nap. And I was like, that's the man. That's the one for me right there. And so this is what Ruth does. She wakes up early and she does the next needed things. I want to read to you a little excerpt from this book. It's called The Liturgy of the Ordinary by Tish Harrison Warren. And she says, "And every new day, this is the turn my heart must make. I'm living this life right in front of me, this one where marriages struggle. The one where we aren't living as we thought we might or as we hoped we would. This one where we are weary, where we want to make a difference, but we aren't sure where to start. where we have to get dinner on the table or our kids' teeth brushed, where we have back pain and boring weeks, where our lives look really small, where we doubt, where we wrestle with meaninglessness, where we worry about those that we love, where we struggle to meet our neighbors and love those closest to us, where we grieve and where we wait. But on this particular day, Jesus knows me and declares me his own. On this day, he is redeeming the world, advancing his kingdom, calling us to repent and grow, teaching his church to worship, draw near to us, and making a people all his own. And that is what we see happening here. On this day, it's an ordinary day. Ruth gets up in the morning, there's a harvest going on, and she says, you know what, Naomi, is it okay if I go and glean in the fields? And Naomi says, go, my daughter. Go. And so she gets up. It's just an ordinary day for her. She doesn't know that she's about to meet her kinsman redeemer. She doesn't know that she's going to come home overflowing with blessing. She has no idea. She's just getting up. She's doing the next needed thing. And some of you today, I just want to encourage you, if you're having a hard time, if you're in hardship, if you're struggling, ask the Lord, what is just the next needed thing? And do that next thing. So she goes in, she's off into these fields. Now I just want to give you some backstory. In the Hebrew law, in Leviticus, God makes a provision for the poor and the foreigners. And in Leviticus 19, 9 through 10, this is part of the law. So this is what the field owners like Boaz, they would have followed this law. He says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So God gives instruction to the landowners, and he says, leave margin around the field so that the poor and the widow and the foreigner can come and glean, cutting and gathering the grain of stalks. So that's what Ruth does. She heads off, she leaves Bethlehem, the little town, and she goes out. The fields were all around Bethlehem. So she goes out into the fields, and she's just looking. And she says to Naomi, I'm just going to look for somebody where I can find favor. And that was her intention today. I'm just going to go do the next thing. I'm going to go look for some place to go, and hopefully I'll find favor somewhere. So I think this is where, in verse 3, the next verse is where the author does something funny. He says, and by happenstance, she happened into Boaz's field. Another way it says is, by chance, she chanced into Boaz's field. Now we know that God is a God, it's not a fate here. This is not fate like some thing out there that's happening. It is God's provision. It's God's providence. It's God's providence that's what's about to happen to her. Providence is God's care for her. It's God's care for you. Do we have that slide? Providence versus fate. This is no chancing in God's plan here. There's no chance of chances. There's no happens of happenstances, okay? God, it's like we've got a split screen in this movie where God's up here and this 30,000, he's looking, and you know he's rooting for her, and you know look, Ruth, you don't even know what's about to happen. This is awesome. She's going to the right field. It's like he blows, go that way. And I can attest this has happened in my life. This has happened in my life. And you don't know it at the time. Ruth didn't know it at the time when she walked into Boaz's field. She didn't know that she was walking into a place that was going to change her life. But she found out later. She realized later, you can look back, right, at our lives in the past, and we can see points in our timeline where we go, oh my gosh, I happened to chance into that field, and God bless me, and I can't even believe it. So we want to recognize those times in our life when God does that. And we want to say, yes, thank you, God. I did find favor. It's like her heart says, she didn't even breathe that prayer. I mean, she did breathe that prayer. She didn't even voice the prayer. Lord, she didn't say, Lord, I pray that I find favor today. That's not what she did. She just said, hey, but Naomi, I want to go out there and glean, and I hope I find favor. It's like she just, hope I find favor. And then here she comes across it. And God answered her prayer. So this is no coincidence. No chances in God's plan. She walks into this field early in the morning, and she asks the foreman. She says, can I glean here? And he's like, okay, sure. So she starts gleaning in the field. She works all morning long. She takes a short break. And then by it happened to happen that Boaz just happened to chance by his field that day. Now, Boaz is a rich man. He's got a lot of fields. But he happened to chance on by the one where Ruth was out there gleaning in the field, hardworking, little cute Ruth, right? And so this is one of those Hallmark, you go, of course, the guy comes to the field because that's predictable. So this is one of those ways that the author is saying, hey, look, pay attention. Something's about to happen. God's doing something amazing. So then in verse 4, Boaz speaks. He speaks to Ruth. He does a lot of talking. Ruth does a lot of action. That's one thing we learned about them. Boaz likes to do all the talking, and Ruth likes to do all the action. That's fine. That's good. So it works for them. And so Boaz greets his workers with a blessing, and then he inquires about Ruth, and the foreman describes Ruth. He says, she's a hard worker. She's been here since early morning. She is a foreigner, though. She's a foreigner. But she's humble. She did come and ask permission. And so Boaz is watching her. And then he speaks to her. And here's our first conversation between Boaz and Ruth, verses 8 and 9. He says to her in verse 8, so Boaz says to Ruth, my daughter, which is like a kindness. He's showing her kindness there. He's not demeaning her. He's like, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Like, stay right here. Stay among my people. Cling to the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after them. I've told the men, I've missed something. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. A couple things I want to point out here. First of all, he says cling to. Now, your scripture may say something different, but in the original, it's cling to. It's that same word where and Ruth told Naomi, I want to cling to you. So he uses the same word, cling to the women, like follow along behind them, cling to them. And then we also see that he mentions that you can drink from the water the jars that the men have filled. Now, in this culture, but as they were leaving in the morning to walk out, the workers would have filled their water jars at the well in the town and carried them out to the field for the day. And usually that was a job that the women did, and the foreigners were often tasked with that job. Hey, you're a foreigner. You're going to carry the water. You're going to be a water carrier, and you can carry the water out here. But Boaz says, you can drink from the water jars that the men have done. And it doesn't really, we go, okay, fine, that's great. But to her, that was, I am taking special notice and special care of you. And she falls on her face before him. And she says, I think I have this one on here. She says she's overwhelmed by this kindness. And she says, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you would notice me a foreigner? Here she's recognizing, I'm finding favor here. She may not be putting the pieces together to realize, hey, this morning I was looking for favor, and here is somebody who is finding favor, and she's overwhelmed by it. And she's like, I am a foreigner. Why would you bless me in this way? Sometimes God's kindness overwhelms us when we least expect it. Well, Boaz, he blesses Ruth. He recognizes her faithfulness to Naomi. He says in the next verses, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. And I love that picture. And she's going to use that same terminology in the next chapter that John's going to talk about next week. She's going to repeat under the wings. She's going to repeat that back to Boaz as the story develops. But you'll have to come back for the next installment next week. So we have this imagery, and we see this throughout Scripture. It's in Psalm 91. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. We see it in Matthew, and Jesus says, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. This is a very tender picture that Boaz is using. Come and gather, and I'm going to protect you, because she was actually in danger. We see it repeated multiple times that she could have very easily been assaulted. That would have been the norm for her to be assaulted in the field, because he says it multiple times. Remember, this is the time just after the conquest. These people, the Israelites, as John has mentioned last week, they were not living according to the law all the time. They were not like these holy people. There was a lot of craziness going on, we could say. And so Ruth took it, she kind of, when she went out that morning, she was walking into danger that she was pretty well aware of, to go and do this job of gleaning in the field. And Boaz he keeps reminding his workers, don't touch her, don't assault her, you leave her alone. And he says, I'm going to protect you. Stay with me. So after this, we see, as Jonathan read before in our reading, the story continues where she goes out, she continues gleaning, and then there's lunch. And she comes in for lunch. And she kind of may have stayed kind of back over on the side as the workers the lunch had been brought in for the workers. The workers are having their lunch, and she's kind of, back over here because Boaz calls her in. He says, come on over here. Eat the lunch that I have for my servants. So he's providing lunch for her. And she goes away with a doggy bag to take home. So she is so, she fills, her stomach is filled. She has bread. She dips it in the wine. So he's just not giving her the stale leftovers. He's giving her the best. He's giving her what he is eating. That's what she's eating. And then he's like, oh, he serves her grain. I mean, this is just over the top. This is over the top love and care for her. It is loving kindness that we see that Boaz is demonstrating toward Ruth. And like I said, she goes home with a doggy bag. She's got leftovers to take home because she probably left that morning and hadn't eaten anything because they didn't have anything. So he sends her home. And God's provision is always abundant. He doesn't just give enough. He gives more than we expect. He goes over the top. That is who our God is. And we see that picture in this man, Boaz, who was a real man. And I want to point out, she asks, why are you taking such care of me? I'm a foreigner. Don't you realize? As I read this, we know as the New Testament reader, because of the genealogy in Matthew, that Boaz was the son of Rahab. Now, some of you may not know who Rahab is, and that's okay. Rahab was a foreigner herself. She was a prostitute. And she is the one who lived in Jericho. And this Boaz was born just after the conquest. So Joshua and Caleb and the Battle of Jericho and all that happened, that would have been Boaz's parents. Okay? So Rahab was living in Jericho. She was a foreigner worshiping other gods. And she was the one who hid the spies in her house. And then she says to the spies, hey, would you not forget me? When your God comes to conquer my people, would you not forget me? Would you spare me? And they say, yes, we'll spare you. Just leave the cord out of your window. And she was spared. When the Israelites came and they walked, remember they marched around, you remember from Sunday school? They marched around 7 days, 7 times, and then the walls come tumbling down. That's Boaz's mom. I'll just let that settle. Boaz's mom? What stories do you think he grew up hearing told in his house? About how she lived through that? I mean, the walls came tumbling down. Her whole entire city was destroyed. Every person. But she was spared by this God, by these people. And she settled among the Israelites. And then she marries an Israelite man and she has Boaz. And then I think there was something about Ruth that Boaz, he recognized some part of his mom in Ruth, and the way she was industrious, the way she was courageous, and he sees that in her, and he's like, it's like I see my mom over there. And I have this soft spot in my heart for this foreigner because she reminds me of someone I love. And so your story, your past, all that God has done in your life and the life of your family, don't be surprised when that empathy that he has developed in you comes out and is used for the good of those around you in your future. Don't be surprised, because that's how God's economy works, right? He's going to use the circumstances of your past for your good and the good of those around you if you let him. Okay, so Boaz continues to be generous. He instructs his workers, he says, leave extra grain for Ruth. Now, they would have gathered stalks of grain. And in the Leviticus law, it's like if anything is dropped, the workers can't go back and pick it up. So he's like, hey, intentionally drop bundles of grain for her to pick up. And so she's gleaning in the field, and she's like, oh my gosh, they're dropping bundles. I'm going to go get that bundle. I'm going to take it. And then she works all day long. She probably borrows his threshing floor, because we know she doesn't just gather the stalks of grain. She goes and she threshes it. You need a threshing floor for that. I'm sure that Boaz lent her his. And so she goes and threshes it into the evening. And when she comes home, and this is so comical. This would have been one of those Hallmark, like you go, come on. This is so comical. She has 6 gallons of threshed grain that weigh 30 pounds, and she has a doggy bag. Okay? So imagine for a minute, this woman, how in the world does she carry 6 gallons of grain that weighs 30 pounds and a doggy bag? How does she do that? They had to work up some sort of mechanism for her. I mean, she is under the weight. Imagine, she's got to walk all the way back from whatever field she's out in, a mile, 2 away, who knows, walk all the way back into Bethlehem at the end of the day, after having gotten up probably at, dark 30, and walked all the way out there and worked all day long into the evening, and she's coming back. And I love her. She is my kind of gal. And so she walks all the way back, and you can just see her under the like she's like burdened with the blessing of God. Like it is, our God is so good. He is so good that we would go out on a normal day doing our next right thing, and we would come home at the end, and he would have changed our lives. It's astounding that he can do that and that he does it. If you think, oh, this is just a story for Ruth, he's not gonna do that for me. That's a lie. He is gonna do it for you. You do the next needed thing in your life, and he is going to abundantly surprise you with blessing that you can't even imagine. The thing you need, he knows what you need. He knew what Ruth needed, and here he comes, and we're back to Naomi, right? Here comes Ruth. I'm getting all animated now, sorry, y'all. Here comes Ruth. She's burdened down, and she comes back to Naomi, and Naomi sees her coming, and Naomi is shocked. This is come through in the text, the way we read it, but they're stumbling over each other's words. Naomi says, I skipped a slide. I'm going to say this. Naomi, when she left Israel, she was full, and she comes back empty. But Ruth, when she left that morning, she was empty. And she comes back with overflowing abundance. The amount of grain that she had would have lasted Naomi and Ruth weeks. This is weeks worth of food for them. So Naomi's reaction, of course, is, where did you glean today? It actually should be like this. Where in the world did you glean today? Where did you go? How? Okay, that kind of reaction. And then she goes from this bitterness. Remember, she was bitter. She was, I'm not on talking terms with God. Remember, that's where she was. And what does she do? She blesses the Lord. The Lord bless him, Naomi said. Oh, wait, go back to one more. Oh, no, go back one more. Let me make sure I got this. Her mother-in-law asked her, where in the world did you work today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And then the next one, sorry, you were right. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has the Lord. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Remember before, she could not say one good thing about God. And here she's blessing him. She's saying, whoa, he has not stopped showing kindness. Now, that was not the tune she was singing that morning when Ruth left. But she is now, because she sees the hesed, that's that word, that loving kindness. She's seeing the hesed of God. Now, this word is used 3 times in the whole book of Ruth. And the first time it's used is when Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth, she says, may the hesed of God be upon you. And that's when she's trying to get him to go away. May the hesed of God, may the loving kindness of God be upon you. And it's like she blesses Ruth, and then it doesn't occur to her that God is going to answer this prayer. And then here he does answer this prayer. The blessing of God has come upon Ruth, and Naomi recognizes it, and she calls it out. And she says, his loving kindness is amazing. It is abundant. It is abundant loving kindness. So as the story continues, she's talking about Boaz, and she's like, oh, Boaz. Here's foreshadowing for you for the next time. You have to come back. Boaz, he's our kinsman redeemer. What in the world? And you're going to find out what a kinsman redeemer is next week, and how that is going to change the life of Ruth and Naomi for sure, and affect the lineage of Christ, which is amazing. And we see that Christ is our kinsman redeemer, and Boaz, of course, is a picture of Christ in our lives and the ways in which he cares for us, and he loves us with his loving kindness. And then I love this part right at the end of the chapter. And Ruth goes, oh yeah, and by the way, he told me I should come back every single day until the end of the harvest. And you're like, what? Imagine 30 pounds of grain every day. Who knows? 30 pounds of grain every day until the end of harvest. It's like this blessing is not just this one-time thing. It's not just for today. You go back, you get up and do the next right thing again. You do the next needed thing tomorrow. Just look out for the ways in which he's going to bless you. And then you get up and you do the next needed thing the day after that, and you don't know what's going to happen. And before she finds out, she continues working in the fields all the way through the harvest, and she's lived with her mother-in-law. And you think, wow. And then next week, Naomi's going to get crazy. That's what Naomi's going to do. She's going to have some ideas about how to make this story go a little further. And God blesses that too. So what can we learn from this story? What are some takeaways? Well, Ruth, she took small, faithful steps, and God orchestrated a blessing. And so again, I want to ask, I think this is something that, as I prepared for this this week, that was a week. I tell you, we all had a week. Do we all have a week? Do you have a week? I know we did in our home. It was a challenging week. And there were days when I woke up and I'm like, oh my goodness, if I can just get myself out of the bed. But God has blessed us. He has shown his loving kindness to me this week, to my husband this week, and his work in ways that we wouldn't have expected. And we just had to get up and do the next needed thing. So what small, faithful step can you take in your life toward greater trust and faith in our God? And also, as you go through this week, please pay attention. I think the Lord wants you to pay attention to the favor that he shows you through the week, the loving kindness. Don't just go through your day. Sometimes people call this an examine. Some people do this practice at the end of the day. Sometimes I do it at the end of the week on a Saturday, where I think back through my week. And one of the things that you're specifically supposed to do is look for the ways that God was working in your life that week. Looking for this hesed, this loving kindness of God, and just acknowledging it to him. He really likes it when you enjoy his show. He really wants you to enjoy his show. Because he cares so much about you His story that he has written in your life, it is profound and amazing. And he's written a good show for you, John and Anne, and all of you, and Cindy. So we've come together today. This is one of the things we do as a congregation, as a church, is we come together to voice to him all those hesed moments that we've had this week, all those times this week where we have seen him and his loving kindness toward us. And we just want to say today, I want to say to you, Lord, today, we see your loving kindness, the hand of God. We see your hand at work in our lives today. We look back on this week, and it's been a week of uncertainty for many of us. We know, I personally know, our family knows 30 people who've lost their jobs this week. 30 people. But we see your hand at work, Lord, because you are good, and we're going to continue doing the next needed thing, because even when life is hard, even when we feel like we have no protection, even though when we feel alone, we have not a penny to our name, you see us, and you have a plan and a purpose, and you care for us. And we ask you, Lord, to help us to recognize those times in this past week when you have blessed us. And we want to worship you for that today, because you are so worthy of it. And we love you. And that's it. Amen.